I asked my cheating wife's lover to give her my divorce letter. I made a point of looking him in the eye, and made it clear, if you hand this over, I'll leave you alone. He hesitated, a shadow of doubt passed across his face, but in the end, he did exactly as I asked. And I knew he would deliver, not because it was right, but because he had something to gain from it, something I still didn't fully understand. When she received the letter, she was shocked. A part of me, the part she betrayed and humiliated, awaited this moment with silent revenge. But another part, the part that still remembered the years together, the promises and shared dreams, wanted to see something beyond the shock. I wanted to see repentance. I wanted to see some evidence that, somewhere, she still cared. But her reaction was pure horror, as if she had been hit by a blow she hadn't expected, even after everything she'd done. And then, something began to emerge, a truth that was hidden behind every detail of the betrayal, and I felt like I was the one being deceived once again. What the letter said was simple: our marriage was over. I didn't want shouting, I didn't want any more arguments. I just wanted her to know that the game is over. There was no longer a life for her to hide behind, pretending to be a devoted wife while running into the arms of another. And in a way, it was a way to get her lover to finally confront her too. What I didn't expect was what would come next, and that's when I realized that my little revenge wasn't as simple as I imagined. I didn't catch her in the act, but I knew. And that is, in some ways, even worse. Knowing that while I was dedicated to everything we built together, she was lying, hiding, and cheating. I asked myself countless times how she had the courage to look into my eyes every day and smile, to prepare dinner as if everything was fine, to lay next to me without the slightest hesitation. There were times when I thought I was going crazy, that maybe I was making up stories in my head to justify the growing coldness between us. But then the confirmation came, and it was like a punch straight to the gut. She was having an affair. I confronted her, and she denied it at first, of course. He said I was exaggerating, that I was imagining things. She even played the victim, crying and asking how I could doubt her. I almost fell for it. Almost. But something in the way she defended herself, something in her gaze, seemed too fragile, like a house of cards about to collapse. So, I looked further, and that's how I got to him. Her lover. The man who was destroying my life, who had infiltrated what I believed to be a solid union, and was stealing everything. When I finally found him, it wasn't like the movies. There was no fight, no physical confrontation. No. There was just me, with a neutral expression, holding the divorce letter and handing it to him. Give her this. I could see the surprise in his eyes. And why would I do that? He asked, trying to sound confident, but there was a tremor in his voice. Because if you do, I'll leave you alone, I replied, knowing that he wanted to believe that he wanted everything to be resolved simply, without scandals, without complications. He did what I asked, but I knew he had no idea he was being manipulated, and, in fact, even I didn't know how much. I knew something wasn't right. There was an invisible layer behind that look he exchanged with her when he handed over the letter, as if a part of the truth was still hidden, a part that escaped me but was about to surface. Her betrayal was painful enough, but that wasn't all. There was something more, something they were hiding, that I still hadn't fully realized. The days after the letter was delivered were silent, almost harrowing. She called me, tried to talk, but I didn't answer. I didn't want to hear excuses, I didn't want to hear justifications. I wanted answers. And I knew they would come, sooner or later. I just needed to wait, give space for the chaos to unfold naturally. But what I didn't know was how much I was involved in something that went far beyond simple betrayal. And it began to reveal itself, slowly, in the little details I missed, in the conversations I thought were harmless, in the looks I didn't interpret correctly. That's when I started putting the pieces together. A conversation that I overheard, a comment he made, and that I only understood the real meaning of much later. He wasn't just a lover. There was something more there. And the more I thought, the more it gnawed at me, the more I needed to know. I couldn't stop anymore. If I was going to accept the end of everything, I needed to understand what was really happening. And then, finally, the truth came out. She hadn't just betrayed our marriage. She had been manipulated, used, and her lover had an agenda of his own, a carefully calculated plan that went far beyond a forbidden love affair. He had seduced her, yes, but not out of love, not out of desire. He had a motive, a personal vendetta, and I was the real target. Her betrayal was just a tool. And suddenly, I realized that my own plan of revenge had been predicted, calculated, and used against me, and that I was at the mercy of a game I didn't even know existed. And now, everything I thought I knew went up in smoke. I didn't know who was cheating on who was the real villain or the real victim. The only certainty I had was that, while I waited for her to feel the pain of being exposed, I myself was falling into a web of lies that were wrapping themselves around me. And, for the first time, I realized that this story of betrayal was not so simple, and that there was still a lot to be revealed. But what did he really want? And why did she look so terrified when she read the letter, as if she knew the worst was yet to come? I don't know all the answers yet, but I'm determined to find out. After all, if there's one thing I've learned, it's that there's nothing more dangerous than underestimating someone who has a secret to hide. Welcome to our channel. Here, we do not support any type of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they show how infidelity can destroy lives, homes and hearts. The goal is to make it clear that, in the real world, cheating brings nothing but pain and regret. Get ready, because now comes a shocking story, full of secrets, lies and twists. Happy listening, and remember, the truth always comes out. The living room was submerged in soft gloom, lit only by the dim lights of the buildings that squeezed in through the window. It was a typical modern apartment in the heart of the city, with elegant and sophisticated touches, the result of years of work and dedication. Sitting in a brown leather armchair, Daniel held a glass of whiskey in a steady hand, but the lost look in his eyes suggested that he was not savoring the drink, he was, in fact, trying to find answers. The apartment he and his wife, Laura, had set up together was their sanctuary, the symbol of what they had built over the years. But that night, the feeling was that something didn't belong there anymore. A growing discomfort, as if the walls, once safe, had become accomplices to something he still couldn't identify. Daniel was 38 years old, a tall man, with striking features and a firm posture, who exuded confidence and competence. He was a lawyer, partner at one of the most respected firms, and was proud to be one of the best in his field. His career flourished from an early age, but he never let success go to his head. On the contrary, he always made a point of balancing his professional and personal life, trying to be present in important moments, both for Laura and for their relationship. Friends described him as trustworthy, a man who insisted on keeping his word. For him, loyalty was not just a quality, but a fundamental pillar. Laura, on the other hand, was sweet, charismatic, and naturally charming. She attracted attention without even trying, not only because of her delicate beauty, but because of the soft way she spoke, because of the gentle gestures she used to communicate. She worked as a marketing director for a luxury cosmetics company, a job that kept her busy and required attendance at events, dinners and launches. She was an intelligent and ambitious woman, and Daniel always admired her ability to shine in any situation. They met at one of these galas years ago, and from the start, the connection was instant. It seemed like they completed each other. Daniel was the calm balance to Laura's vibrant intensity, and together they built a life that many would consider enviable. In recent months, however, something has felt different. There was a subtle coldness in Laura's gestures, a distance that Daniel could no longer ignore. He didn't know how to explain what was happening, and maybe that's why he tried to find reasons in his own head, wondering if it was just stress or the natural wear and tear of the marriage. They still laughed together, still went out to dinner on Fridays, but something in her eyes seemed far away. Like she was in a place he couldn't reach, and he hated that feeling. In moments of silence, Daniel's thoughts ran wild, trying to understand what had changed, when everything had started to fall apart. It was difficult to pinpoint the exact moment when things went off the rails, and perhaps that was what made him so uneasy. He was sure of one thing: he was willing to fight for his marriage, for Laura, for the life they had built. But to do that, I needed to understand what was happening. Laura, in turn, felt suffocated. She loved Daniel, or at least she thought she still did, but something inside her had changed. The perfect routine they had built together seemed to have become a prison, and she found herself increasingly looking for excuses to escape, whether by staying late at work or by getting lost in projects that didn't need her attention but gave her an excuse not to go home right away. The smile she always wore so naturally now seemed forced, a mask she had to maintain to keep him from noticing her insecurities. It wasn't that she didn't like Daniel anymore, but she felt like there was something missing, a flame that used to burn intensely and was now just an almost extinguished ember. And then, there was him. A new face, someone who appeared in Laura's life like a breath of fresh air, a reminder of who she used to be before the full weight of responsibility fell on her shoulders. She met this man at a corporate event, one of those endless nights where everyone smiles with glasses of wine in hand, but barely pays attention to the conversations around them. They met by chance, and the exchange of glances was immediate. It wasn't supposed to be anything more than a casual conversation, but something about the way he looked at her made Laura feel alive again. As if he saw something in her that Daniel no longer saw, or that she herself had forgotten. It was tempting, dangerous, and, at the same time, intoxicating. But what Daniel and Laura built together was strong, at least he believed it was. They had overcome difficulties before. When Daniel began his career as a lawyer, he had to dedicate endless hours to establish himself, and Laura supported him unconditionally, even if it meant sacrificing her own projects. They moved into a small apartment together at the beginning of their marriage, and despite the difficulties, they always found a way to have fun, to transform simple moments into memories that they would cherish forever. When they managed to buy the apartment they now lived in, it was as if they had reached the culmination of a long journey, and Daniel believed that nothing could shake what they had. Recently, Laura started attending more events without him. Before, it was common for them to go together, but now she often said it was a professional commitment, something that required her undivided attention. Daniel didn't like to argue, so he agreed, but he knew there was a difference between trusting and ignoring. Deep down, he wondered if she was hiding something, and increasingly, those nights when he waited for Laura to return were filled with a heavy, almost suffocating silence. He found himself staying up late, pacing around the house, checking his cell phone from time to time to see if she had sent him any messages. Laura hated that feeling of lying to him, but at the same time, there was something that compelled her to continue, as if she were trapped in a cycle that she couldn't break. When she was with Daniel, she tried to act as she always did, but her thoughts betrayed her, making her feel torn between two realities that could not coexist. And at the same time, she knew he noticed. The way Daniel looked at her, trying to find an answer in her face, made her feel guilty. But that guilt was temporary, it disappeared as soon as she walked away, when she felt free to be who she wanted to be, even if just for a few hours. It was late afternoon when Daniel decided to do something he had never done before. He decided to surprise Laura at work, hoping that maybe by seeing her in her element, he could find some spark that would rekindle what they had been missing. But she wasn't there. One of the colleagues reported that Laura had left early to resolve personal matters. Those words kept echoing in his head on the way home. It wasn't jealousy, it wasn't paranoia. It was an intuition he couldn't ignore, and for the first time, he began to consider that perhaps the answers he sought weren't so easy to accept. That night, Daniel looked at the apartment and felt an emptiness he had never felt before. He knew there was something behind the forced smiles, the apologies, and the distant looks. But he also knew that to find out, he would need to be willing to face truths he might not want to hear. Because if he was right, there was no way back. Daniel woke up that morning with a strange feeling. There was something in the air, an invisible tension that made his chest tighten, as if an omen was haunting him. He tried to ignore it, tried to go about his routine as he always did, but things around him seemed different, distorted by a growing discomfort. As he ate breakfast, his thoughts returned to the night before, when he stared at the clock while Laura sent a short message saying she would be late. "Last-minute meeting," she explained. Those words, which would have sounded harmless before, now resonated like a bitter lie. During the day, he tried to focus on work, immerse himself in meetings, in the emails that flooded his inbox, but his mind wandered away. Every vibration from the cell phone in my pocket made my heart race, a silent anxiety that something would be revealed. He thought about calling Laura, but he was afraid of what he might find on the other end. So he decided to act. If there was something wrong, he needed to know. That afternoon, he left the office early, a vague excuse for his colleagues, and drove through the city, without a specific destination, but with a plan slowly forming. He remembered the address of the event Laura had mentioned the night before, something about a cocktail party for important clients. He didn't know exactly what he expected to find, but he needed to confirm if his fears had any basis or if he was just losing his mind. When he parked the car in front of the building, he watched people leaving. Men in suits, women elegantly dressed, laughing and talking. They seemed unconcerned, a common sight that normally wouldn't catch your attention. But then he saw her. Laura walked out the front door, smiling as she spoke to a man he didn't recognize. Tall, handsome, with dark hair combed back. The two seemed too comfortable together, a closeness that made Daniel's stomach turn. For a moment, he thought about getting out of the car and going to them, but something stopped him. He watched, trying to catch anything that could confirm his suspicions, unaware that he was about to receive confirmation that everything he feared was real. Laura and the man walked away, and Daniel followed at a safe distance, his hands shaking slightly on the steering wheel. When they arrived at the parking lot, he saw them stopping next to a car and, without saying a word, the man held Laura's hand. She didn't move away. On the contrary, he smiled at him in a way that Daniel knew well, a smile that used to be his alone. And then, she kissed him. The image of that scene was like a punch, a raw and intense pain that made Daniel lose his breath. He felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet, as if everything he believed in was crumbling before his eyes. For a moment he stood still, not knowing whether he should confront them there, in the street, under the pale streetlights, or whether he should simply turn away and pretend he had never seen anything. But he could no longer deceive himself. There was no ignoring what was right in front of him. Laura and the man's car left the parking lot, and Daniel hesitated for a moment before deciding to follow them. He needed more answers, he needed to understand where this was going. And so, he followed them through streets he knew well, until they arrived at a small, discreet, almost hidden hotel. The kind of place someone would choose to avoid being seen. When they entered, Daniel parked a safe distance away and waited. Time seemed to pass in a distorted way, every minute a torment as he tried to find meaning in it. He knew he could invade that space, confront them, cause a scandal. But at the same time, I felt a strange need to maintain control. He didn't want to act on impulse, didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. Daniel stood there, still in the car, as his mind went in circles, trying to process the betrayal he had just witnessed. He imagined Laura lying, smiling at him in the mornings while her nights were shared with another. Her every word now seemed like a lie, every promise broken before it was even made. The love he felt, that he thought was unshakable, suddenly seemed fragile, brittle like glass. When Laura left the hotel a few hours later, Daniel was still there. He saw her say goodbye to the man with another quick kiss, a soft touch on the cheek that seemed natural, as if it were part of a routine they had established. And it was there, at that moment, that Daniel realized that it wasn't just a passing case. It was something that had been happening for a long time, something she skillfully hid from him. He thought about everything he had sacrificed for that relationship, all the times he put her desires above his own, all the plans they made together. And now, it all seemed like a farce. Daniel returned home that night as if he were in a dream or a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. He entered the apartment and felt like the walls were suffocating him, as if the entire space was permeated by Laura's lies. He walked around the room, touching the furniture, the photos that decorated the shelves, and realized that he no longer knew who the person next to him in those images was. He wondered if anything had been real, or if it was all just a facade. When Laura finally arrived a few hours later, Daniel was sitting at the kitchen table, his face illuminated only by the cool light of the lamp. She came in smiling, as if nothing had happened, and leaned in to kiss him, but he pulled away. There was a coldness in Daniel's gaze that made her stop, hesitant, and for a moment, the silence between them was deafening. "We need to talk," he said finally, and the sound of his own voice seemed strange, as if he were listening to someone else speak. Laura hesitated, but nodded, feeling that something had changed but not knowing what. "Of course." "About what?" Daniel stared at her for a long time, as if he was searching for some truth in her face, something that confirmed what he saw or something that denied it, in some way. But there was nothing there but a forced calm, a mask he knew all too well. "Where have you been today?" he asked, his voice low, controlled, but with a hint of pain that he couldn't hide. Laura blinked, surprised by the direct question, and for a moment she looked confused. "I already said, work, meetings," she started, but stopped when she saw that he didn't believe her. "No more." And then, Daniel spoke the words she so feared to hear. "I saw you today. With him." Laura froze, the smile slowly fading from her lips. Her expression was one of disbelief, as if she expected this to be a bad joke. But she knew deep down that there was no more running away. Daniel had seen her. And in that moment, he knew there would be no more excuses, no more lies that could fix what was broken between them. The living room seemed smaller that night. There was tension in the air, thick and palpable, as if all the walls were closing in around them. Daniel was standing by the window, watching the lights outside with an expression that mixed exhaustion and determination. Laura was sitting on the sofa, silent, her eyes fixed on her husband, not knowing how to start the conversation she knew was coming. He had asked her to stay home that night. There was something important to discuss, and the tone in Daniel's voice left no room for argument. "What do you want, Daniel?" Laura broke the silence, her voice fragile, almost hesitant. She tried to meet his gaze, but he continued to stare out the window, as if searching for some answer in the distant horizon. She knew he had seen it, she knew there was no denying it anymore, but she also had no idea what to expect. Daniel turned slowly, his eyes fixed on her now, filled with a mix of pain and coldness that made her shudder. "I want the truth," he replied, his voice low but with a firmness that seemed unshakable. "No lies, no excuses, just the truth, Laura." He approached her, his steps slow and calculated, as if each movement required monumental effort. "You owe me that, at least." Laura felt a lump form in her throat. She wanted to defend herself, she wanted to say that none of it mattered, that it was all a mistake and that it meant nothing. But she knew that any excuse would only make things worse. She took a deep breath, fighting back the tears that threatened to fall, and nodded, finally ready to face whatever was coming. "Okay," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I owe you this." Daniel pulled out a chair and sat in front of her, the distance between them short, but it seemed like an abyss. He was silent for a moment, as if trying to find the right words for what came next. "I want to know, why?" His voice wavered slightly, a crack in the facade of control he tried to maintain. "Why did you do that? Why did you lie to me?" Laura looked away, unable to look at him as he spoke. "I don't know, Daniel," she murmured, her voice breaking. "I felt lost, suffocated." It was as if, she hesitated, searching for the right words. "Like I forgot who I am, and he made me feel alive." "Alive?" Daniel repeated, the word falling from his lips like an accusation. "And I didn't make you feel alive?" Everything we built together, all the things I did for you, for us, none of it meant anything? Laura closed her eyes for a moment, letting a tear escape. It meant. It still means. I don't know how to explain it. I didn't want to hurt you, but I lost myself, Daniel. I got lost and didn't know how to get back. She knew her words were weak, that they didn't justify anything she had done. But that was all he had to offer. Silence fell between them again, and for a moment, Daniel seemed to absorb her words, as if he were trying to make some sense of them. He stood up, moving away from her to try and contain the anger that was boiling in his chest. I saw you, Laura. I saw you with him. You looked so comfortable. As if that were natural. As if I didn't exist. He paused, and the bitterness in his voice became more pronounced. And I want to know, since when has this been happening? She hesitated, the words stuck in her throat. A few months ago, she finally admitted, her voice barely audible. But it's not what you think. He's not important. Isn't it important? Daniel repeated in disbelief. You spent months lying to me, pretending everything was fine, sneaking out to meet him, and now you say it's not important? He laughed, a bitter, humorless laugh. So what's important to you, Laura? Because I clearly am not. Laura opened her mouth to respond, but was interrupted by the sound of a knock on the door. An unexpected sound, which echoed in the room and left them silent for a moment. Daniel frowned in confusion and looked at Laura, who looked equally perplexed. Are you expecting someone? He asked, trying to keep his tone neutral, but the look in her eyes said she had no idea what was going on either. He hesitantly went to the door and opened it. On the other side was Laura's lover, standing there with a tense and troubled expression. Daniel stood still, staring at him, trying to process what he saw. What are you doing here? He asked, unable to hide the surprise and anger in his voice. I need to talk to you, the man replied, his voice urgent and desperate. I know you hate me, and you have every right to hate me, but there's something you need to know. Laura got up from the sofa, surprised and visibly uncomfortable. What are you doing here? She repeated, but her lover didn't look at her. He kept his focus on Daniel, as if he was preparing himself for a confession he had been carrying for a long time. Daniel looked at him, confused and wary. Say what you have to say and leave, he replied, his tone clipped. You've done enough. The lover took a deep breath, as if preparing for a death sentence. I didn't get involved with Laura by chance. I looked for you because I wanted to get closer to you. I wanted to destroy you. His words hung in the air, and for a moment, no one said anything. Daniel looked at him, confused, trying to find some meaning in that confession. What? Laura finally broke the silence, her voice a horrified whisper. What are you talking about? She approached her lover, trying to understand what he was saying, but he raised his hand, as if asking her to stop. This has nothing to do with you, Laura, he said, without looking at her. I approached you because I knew that was the only way to get to him. He turned his gaze to Daniel, who now looked more lost than ever. You don't remember me, do you? Daniel frowned, trying to remember. It should, he replied, the frustration in his voice growing. The man nodded, a sad smile forming on his lips. I hoped so, but I don't think so. He paused, eyes fixed on Daniel's. Years ago, you got a big case. $1 million contract that saved one company from bankruptcy and destroyed another in the process. This other company belonged to my family. My father lost everything because of you. Our home, our livelihood, everything. He tried to get back on his feet, but couldn't, and ended up killing himself. And I spent years trying to find a way to get revenge, to destroy you the same way you destroyed our family. Daniel remained silent, processing what he heard. He vaguely remembered the case, a complicated settlement that involved legal wrangling in a power play that he had won. He had never thought about the impact that had had on someone's life, but now, those actions were coming back to haunt him in ways he never could have predicted. Laura was motionless, her hand over her mouth, trying to understand everything that was being revealed. "You used me?" she asked in disbelief, her voice wavering. "Did you approach me to get revenge on him?" The lover looked at her with a sad and guilty look. "Yes," he admitted, finally. "But, it ended up becoming more than that. I didn't expect to get really involved. But, in the end, revenge took over." He turned to Daniel again. "I wanted you to feel the same kind of pain I felt. I wanted your life to be destroyed, and I knew the only way to do that was to use someone you love." Daniel felt the world spin around him. All the anger, all the frustration and pain he had felt upon discovering Laura's betrayal were now just a small part of something much bigger. He was not just the victim of infidelity, but of a carefully calculated plan to destroy his life, a revenge that had taken root for years and that was now before him, revealed in a raw and brutal way. He looked at Laura's lover, and then at her, realizing that, in a way, they had both been used, manipulated by a pain he didn't even know existed. And at that moment, Daniel realized that his life would never be the same again. The silence that followed the revelation seemed to swallow everything around. Laura's lover's words had been like a sharp blade, cutting off any chance of easy answers or plausible justifications. The shock was still written on Daniel's face, as he tried to assimilate what he had heard, as if each piece of that story was rearranging his entire perception of what was real. He felt as if everything he knew had been turned inside out, as if the very essence of his life was being questioned, and for a moment he simply didn't know what to do. Laura, on the other hand, seemed paralyzed. Tears streamed down her face, but she made no move to wipe them away. It was as if she was frozen, unable to find a way to defend herself, to understand how she had become part of such a cruel and elaborate plan. She never imagined that she was being used in such a calculated way, that her own life and choices had become tools of cold, premeditated revenge. She felt a mixture of guilt, pain and terrible shame for not having realized it sooner. Daniel looked at the man in front of him, his face hardened, trying to find some trace of regret in his eyes, but there was nothing but an almost unsettling calm. "So that's why you did all this?" he asked, his voice hoarse and restrained, as if holding back a wave of anger that threatened to boil over. "You destroyed what was left of my marriage, just to get revenge?" Laura's lover nodded slowly, his gaze still steady. "Yes," he replied, without hesitation. "I wanted you to know what it's like to lose everything. That you felt the same helplessness that I felt. But," he hesitated, as if searching for the right words, "in the process, I realized that I was dragging other people into my pain, people who, honestly, didn't deserve it." He finally looked at Laura, and the pain in his gaze was palpable. "I didn't expect to care about her, but it happened. And now, all I see are lives destroyed, including mine." Daniel clenched his fists, trying to control the anger that was boiling inside him. "You know nothing about what I lost," he replied, eyes fixed on the man who had destroyed his world. "And you have no idea what I'm feeling right now." "You're right," said the lover finally, his voice softening. "I have no idea. But I needed you to know the truth. I needed to make you understand that. I didn't do this out of gratuitous evil, but because I was blinded by pain. And in the end, I ended up hurting everyone." He paused for a moment, as if expecting some response, but received nothing but silence. Then, he approached Daniel, in a risky gesture, but full of determination. "I can't change what I did. But I can give you a chance to decide what to do now." Daniel felt his body tense, as if every fiber was ready to explode. He wanted to hit the man, he wanted to take out all his frustration, pain and anguish. But at the same time, there was something there, something he couldn't ignore. A raw and ugly truth that unfolded before him, something that transformed that situation into something much more complex than simply betrayal. He wasn't just a cuckolded husband, it was part of a game that had gone on for years, started by a pain he never knew he had caused. And now, he was trapped in a dilemma that challenged all his certainty. "And what do you suggest I do?" Daniel finally asked, sarcasm escaping his voice. "For me to just forget all this and move on. For me to pretend nothing happened." The lover sighed, knowing there was no easy answer. "I don't know what you should do, Daniel. I just wanted you to understand why all this happened. If you want to destroy me, you can do that. I am willing to accept any consequence." He looked at Laura, who still hadn't been able to utter a word since the revelation. "But know that it wasn't her fault. I manipulated everything. She was as much a victim as you." Laura finally found the strength to speak, her voice broken by tears. "It doesn't change what I did, Daniel," she said, staring at her husband with teary eyes. "I betrayed you. I hurt you, and no matter what reason he had, I allowed it to happen. I was weak, and I'm sorry, more than you can imagine." She felt like she was falling into an abyss, unable to find anything to hold on to, knowing that no words or excuses would be enough to fix what was broken. Daniel approached her, the pain in his eyes clear and raw. "I loved you, Laura. I loved it more than anything in this world. And you made me believe that was enough. That everything I did, everything I sacrificed, was worth it." He shook his head, voice wavering. "And now I don't know what's true anymore." The lover watched the scene, feeling the weight of his actions finally fall on him like a ton of bricks. He never imagined that his quest for revenge would lead him to this moment, where everyone involved would be as destroyed as he was. And in that instant, he knew that revenge hadn't brought him the satisfaction he'd hoped for. On the contrary, it had only magnified the pain, turning it into something unbearable. "I'm leaving," he said, finally. "It doesn't make sense for me to stay here. You two need to decide what to do from now on, and I have no right to influence that. I just want you to know that regardless of what I planned, I'm sorry." And for the first time, there was sincerity in his words, an honesty that seemed belated but genuine. He looked at Laura one last time, with deep sadness, and then at Daniel, who didn't look away. "I know this doesn't change anything. But I needed to say it." Daniel watched him leave, and for the first time that night, he felt the real weight of what had happened. He wasn't just a victim, he was a piece in a larger game, manipulated by forces he had never understood. He turned to Laura, seeing the woman he had loved for so many years, and realized that, despite everything, she was also a victim of something that was beyond everyone's control. "And now?" he asked, almost whispering, as if he no longer had the strength to raise his voice. "What do we do, Laura?" She looked at him, tears falling freely, and didn't have an answer. For the first time, she felt completely lost, not knowing how to rebuild something that had been so completely destroyed. But at the same time, I knew I had to try, no matter how impossible it seemed. Daniel took a step back, feeling like he needed some distance to think. The dilemma unfolding before him was more than just to forgive or not to forgive. It was about finding a way to deal with the pain that had been caused by something much bigger than a simple mistake, a betrayal. It was about deciding whether it was worth trying to rebuild or whether what was left was just a pile of rubble from a love that had been destroyed by a storm of heartache and secrets. He left the room, leaving Laura alone on the couch, immersed in tears and regret. And as he walked down the empty hallway, one thing became clear to him: there were no longer certainties, only difficult choices that needed to be made. And he didn't know if he was ready to take them. The days that followed were marked by oppressive silence. Daniel barely spoke to Laura, and the apartment that had once been a cozy home now felt cold and distant, as if everything they had built together had disappeared. Laura tried several times to start a conversation, explain what she felt better, ask for another chance, but the expression on Daniel's face stopped her. There was an invisible but insurmountable barrier between them. He left home early, returned late and spent his nights in silence, staring into space or drinking alone. It was as if he was trying to find a solution to a puzzle that no longer made sense. Laura, in turn, began to realize the weight of her choices. Every moment she spent in the apartment seemed to suffocate her. Daniel's memories, the smells, the objects, everything there reminded her of what she had lost, of what she had destroyed with her own hands. And as much as she tried to hold on to some hope, the reality was that she had betrayed the trust of the man she loved. She knew that if Daniel decided to leave, she couldn't blame him. But still, she couldn't give up. One night, as Daniel stared into a half-empty glass of whiskey, Laura approached, hesitant but determined. "I can't change what happened," she said, her voice shaky but firm. "But I can say that I'm sorry. And I don't expect you to forgive me, but I do hope you know that I never meant to hurt you like that." Daniel listened to her in silence, without looking up from his glass. "If it takes me leaving for you to find peace, I will," she continued, struggling to keep her voice steady. "But if there's a chance, however small, to try to rebuild, I want that. I want to try." Daniel finally looked up at her, and what Laura saw was not anger, but deep sadness. "You don't understand, Laura," he said, his voice filled with a pain he could no longer hide. "It's not just about what you did. It's about everything that came to light after that. It's about realizing that our life was just a stage for someone else's revenge plan. And in the middle of it all, I lost control about who I am. And I don't know how to find that again." The two fell silent, and Daniel finally realized that, in order to move forward, he needed answers, and closure. It wasn't enough to just confront Laura and her lover, he needed to understand what to do with what he had discovered, with the truth that had been forced upon him. So, he decided to find the man who had caused all that, one last time, to resolve what was still pending. They met in a discreet cafe. Daniel arrived early, expecting to see him arrive with the same calculated calm he had shown before. But this time, there was something different. The man looked dejected, as if the revelation had stripped him of any strength he had previously used to maintain his mask of control. They sat at opposite tables, an air of uncertainty hovering between them, until Daniel finally broke the silence. "Why did you come here?" he asked, bluntly. "You said you didn't want to influence my life anymore, but here you are. What do you want from me now?" The lover hesitated, as if struggling to find the right words. "I came to ask for forgiveness," he said, finally. "And not because I think it will change what I did, but because in the end, I realized that the revenge I sought only destroyed me further. I thought ruining your life would bring some relief, but it only brought more emptiness." Daniel listened to him, but his words did not bring the relief the man expected. "And what do I do with it?" Daniel replied, his tone calm but cutting. "I don't need your forgiveness. I need to know how to move on with my life after everything you took from me." The man lowered his head, knowing that, at that moment, any excuse would be empty. "I can't fix what I've done, but I can help in another way. I'm going to get out of here, let you move on without my shadow looming over you. If that helps you find some peace, then at least something good will have come out of it all." That. Daniel was silent for a moment, and then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. "Then do it," he said, getting up to leave. "Go away and let me sort out the rest." That night, Daniel returned home and found Laura in the same place he had left her, on the sofa, holding a cup of cold tea. He sat down next to her, and for the first time in days, he reached out to touch her hand. "I went to find him," he said simply. "He's leaving. Maybe this will help put an end to this story." Laura looked at him, surprised by the gesture, and waited for more, not knowing what that meant. "I don't know what will happen between us, Laura," Daniel continued, his voice soft but with an undeniable sadness. "But I want to try to find a way. Maybe it will never be the same as before, maybe we will never be able to fix everything, but I want to try, if you want to." Laura held his hand tightly, as if this were her last chance to hold on to what was left. "I want to," she whispered, tears flowing silently. In the months that followed, things were difficult. Daniel and Laura tried to rebuild, but there were moments of pain, of resentment, of questions that could never be fully answered. Life was no longer the same, and perhaps it would never be again. But they both knew that, despite everything, they were trying, and that was what mattered. As for the man who sought revenge, he left the city, disappearing as silently as he had appeared. He took with him remorse and the knowledge that his pursuit of what he believed to be justice had, in fact, created a cycle of pain. He learned too late that revenge doesn't cure pain, it just spreads it to more people. And so, life continued. Not perfect, not without scars, but in a way that allowed Daniel and Laura to learn to find some kind of peace amidst the chaos. Maybe they would never go back to who they were, but they moved forward, one step at a time, knowing that each day was a new chance to try to do something different. If you liked this story, leave your comment below and tell us what you thought of the development and the end. And, of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Here, we do not support any kind of betrayal, our stories show how it can devastate lives and leave deep scars. Until next time.